Chapter 10 The Eye, Part 1.
I don't get why we're running away.
Twilight tore her gaze away from the window, looking back to where Rainbow was flying and agitated back and forth across the repurposed cargo hold.
Didn't you run away?
Rainbow came to a sudden stop, glaring at Twilight. Her tail flicked like a whip, making an audible crack that echoed across the bare room.
That was different, Twilight, she snapped. That chump just took me by surprise, and I thought it was more important to warn my friends than to show some griffin who's boss.
Twilight sighed, looking back to the cloudy sky in the window. She'd known that those words would get a rise out of the cocksure Pegasus, and still she'd said them. What had gotten into her?
It wasn't even a good argument. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that.
In the window, Twilight saw Rainbow's reflection cock her head, a confused frown flashing across her face at the easy admission of fault. There were a few seconds where the only sound was the constant ticking of the Argo. The sound of Rainbow's hooves against the metal floor grew gradually closer as she came up to Twilight's side.
Well, I still think we should have just stayed at the estate.
Twilight shook her head, scanning the cloud-ridden horizon once more.
It isn't safe there. You heard what Sea Saber said.
There had been a storm gathering for the past few hours now, and there had been a creeping paranoia stalking her mind ever since. How close could a ship get to them in this weather before it was seen? 2 miles? 1? Was there a ship full of bloodthirsty mercenaries above them even now, sharpening their blades in preparation for the killing blow?
Pfft, whatever.
Rainbow lapsed into a sulking silence, her wings twitching. A little gust of wind toyed with Twilight's mane as Rainbow flapped her wings, flying a lazy loop back to land on the sleeping bag and crates they had cobbled into a makeshift couch. It must have been the dozenth time that the two had revisited the subject, and it ended just like every other before it. Twilight knew that Rainbow kept up her stubborn insistence more out of a desire to act than anything else, but the decision had been made long ago. It was safer to run. Gava was too dangerous. Sea Saber had said so. Everything had happened so fast. Twilight and Applejack had been discussing their next moves with Sea Saber. They'd all been worried about Rainbow's running off, but they knew that they'd never find her if she didn't want them to, and had accepted that she would return once she was ready. What they hadn't been expecting was for her to burst into the room covered in shallow scratches and trailing bundles of knotted rope, shouting about being assaulted by a griffin. Sea Saber had been quick to ask for her assailant's name. Twilight still had to suppress a shiver when she thought of the sudden alarm that had flashed across Saber's normally stern face when Rainbow had given her answer. Gava. A relentless bounty hunter and a fearsome killer, according to Saber. Somehow she had heard of them, found them, and for whatever reason, made them her target.
Now why would she do that?
Applejack had asked.
We ain't done a thing to no pony since we got here.
Because you're valuable,
Sea Saber had said.
Even if the world at large doesn't know about you yet, there's plenty of power players that would pay top bit for ponies like you. You're the most powerful gifted in recorded history by a far margin. I don't know if Gava has a private contract, or if she's just moving in advance, but it doesn't matter either way. If she knows where you are, then you are not safe.
She's not that tough,
Rainbow had said, puffing out her chest.
I beat her all on my own.
You escaped,
Saber corrected.
She still caught you, but she didn't expect you to be such a strong flyer. She'll be back, and I can't know for sure what she'll try. She might sneak inside with her crew and abduct you all in your sleep, or she might pull favors and bust down the front door with a few dozen mercenaries. Highton isn't safe anymore.
Can't we just alert the guards or something?
Applejack had asked.
She'll bribe them,
Saber had said.
Or kill them. It doesn't matter. They won't be willing to die for you, and she'll take you away to another island, outside of Highton's reach. Trust me, we need to move. Now.
That had been just over 2 days ago. They hadn't seen any sign of another ship since leaving Highton, and still Twilight looked out every window she passed, searching for the telltale sign of the bounty hunter ship gaining on them. It was a nerve-wracking experience, made all the worse by the nightmares of rending flesh and bloody teeth that plagued her sleep.
I'm going to go check on our flight,
Twilight said, turning away from the window.
Again?
Rainbow asked. She'd resumed her airborne pacing.
Nothing will have changed in an hour, you know. I just want to quintuple check the course I plotted,
Twilight said. She ignored Rainbow's exaggerated eye roll, crossing the breadth of the hold and stopping before the door. Steam hissed above her as the heavy metal slid out of the way, and she stepped into the hall. Once the immediate threat of being shackled and sold had been dealt with, Twilight and her friends had discussed their next move. In practice, it was mostly Rainbow Dash supporting every perceived step forward suggested, while Applejack admitted that she didn't know enough to make a good decision, and Fluttershy stood in a corner quietly whimpering. It hadn't taken more than half an hour for them to agree with Twilight. From what Crazy Rich had told them before they left, Gava had known that Rarity and Pinkie were leaving but didn't know their destination. They didn't want to risk leading Gava straight to their friends. Following them wasn't an option for now, but a letter could be sent later on. Meanwhile, their only lead on the corruption was Princess Luna's expedition into the Everfree that the research group's notes had mentioned. There was nothing to do but follow it. They would decide what to do next based on what they found. They would dive into the Everfree.
Rarity! Wakey, wakey, sleepyhead!
Rarity's ears flicked as the door shook. She raised her head blearily and rubbed a hoof at her eyes.
Do you need something, darling?
A massive yawn escaped her as she squinted at the source of the pounding.
It's morning, silly filly.
Pinkie's squeaky voice was thankfully muffled by the thick wood of the door.
Time to get up.
Morning?
Rarity mumbled. That couldn't be right. A weak glow came off her horn as she turned to the window and pulled the heavy curtain aside. Pale dawn sunlight streamed into the room, coloring the jumbled scribblings and sketches scattered about in the cold light of morning.
So it is.
Can I come in?
There were a few more heavy thumps that Rarity took to be Pinkie banging her head against the door.
Do you need to make yourself proper?
Rarity had a vague feeling that she was being mocked, but couldn't muster the energy for any kind of counter.
I'm fine, dear. Come in.
The seamstress suppressed another yawn as Pinkie pushed through the door.
Wowee!
She said, eyes widening.
What happened here? Did you have some kind of crazy terrific party and not invite me?
Well...
Rarity made a hesitant survey of her room, her lips stretching into a pained grimace. Strips of fabric, discarded sheets of crumpled paper littered every corner like toys in a fool's playroom. A pair of half-dressed ponykins were tangled up next to the window, and the bed had been stripped bare, its sheets arranged into a makeshift tent. The one relatively clear space was the very center of her desk, where several crisp design sheets were stacked next to a pair of empty inkwells and a broken quill. She let out a content sigh as she flipped through the papers.
It was a busy night.
Oh, did you draw something? What is it?
Pinkie asked, leaning over Rarity's shoulder.
Let me guess. Sea pony. Balloon animal. Dancer.
Rarity slapped a hoof over the other mare's muzzle.
Patterns, darling. For the tents?
Oh, that makes more sense.
Pinkie giggled, stepping back.
Ready for breakfast? I baked it myself.
Baked?
Rarity grimaced, suppressing a groan.
Certainly, dear. I'll just...
she yawned, sorting the finished designs into a folder with her magic.
I'll be right there. Okie dokie Loki. Don't take too super long or there won't be any cupcakes left.
Pinkie zipped out of the room in a pink blur, the assorted clutter of the room briefly twisting in her wake. Another yawn. Rarity just barely remembered the triumph of finally finishing her work last night. How long had she been sleeping there? She stole a quick glance to the open door before surreptitiously wiping up a sizable puddle of drool.
A lady does not drool.
Closing the door with her magic, she picked herself up and walked to the attached restroom. She let out a little whimper as she looked in the mirror, taking in the frazzled hair and baggy eyes. Not wanting to tarry too long, she allowed herself only 30 minutes to fix her coiffure and apply some choice makeup. Another 10 were spent browsing the swiftly growing collection of clothes she had been assembling ever since acquiring the needed tools and fabrics from Mr. Rich. She picked out a relatively simple, short-hemmed white dress with blue highlights that matched her eyes. It wasn't too fancy, but it was fit for a lady of her stature. Finished, Rarity pouted at her reflection. Her exhaustion was still readily apparent despite her efforts.
It will have to do.
Slipping her night's work into a satchel and slinging it over her neck, she made for the yacht's dining room. The Sip of Ambrosia was a sleek ship, with a 2-story hull twice the length of the Argo suspended between a pair of propellers. Unlike the loud, steam-ridden hulls of the salvage ship, the interior of the Ambrosia was designed with a much cleaner presentation in mind. Thick carpets and simple paintings took the place of open vents and gauges. The doors opened with no burst of steam or other such fuss, and a quiet, orchestral piece could always be heard in public spaces, carried on a network of polished brass. Rarity looked out a long window lining the hall as she walked, taking in the view of Fellis Island below. It was larger than the High-Ton mainland, although completely lacking in any of the smaller, trailing islands that made up much of the other city, and far less developed in comparison. Whereas just about every inch of High-Ton was paved over and built upon, Fellis had far rougher terrain that had made it difficult for the same type of all-consuming architecture to develop. The northern edge of the island had little worse than a few rolling hills, but as one went further south, the hills grew gradually steeper and rockier, and the southernmost part of the island rightfully deserved to be called a mountain. The land there leaned out over the base of the island like a teetering drunk, the bottom surface plagued with sharp outcroppings and hanging stalactites, as if it was just half of a mountain ripped away from the earth, leaving its twin drowning somewhere beneath the ocean waves. The Ambrosia was moored to a small tower near the central part of the island. The buildings there mostly squatted on hilltops, with series of rickety wooden hoof bridges and wide stone archways connecting neighboring peaks. Narrow rivers ran from south to north in the leftover valleys, converging into a trio of waterfalls that trailed from the island's northern edge. Rarity couldn't help but grimace as her eyes traced the shores of said rivers. According to Whitehorn, they were normally left largely uninhabited. A recent set of unprecedented natural disasters, however, had displaced entire islands worth of ponies. As of yet, it was only small islands or sparsely populated barren lands that had been affected, but the surplus of land on Fellis had made it the ultimate destination for most of the refugees. A veritable city of tents had sprouted up its rocky valleys during the past decade, creating an equinoctiarian disaster that had gone almost entirely unnoticed by Equestria at large. But that, of course, was why Whitehorn had planned the trip, and why Rarity had elected to come along. She resisted the sudden urge of yet another yawn as she arrived in the dining room. The long table was by that time mostly clean of ponies and dishes alike, with only Whitehorn and Pinkie Pie remaining. The unicorn was busily reading over a trio of broadsheets spread out on the table before him, while Pinkie was obliviously chatting away beside him.
And then I screamed, "Boarding party, woohoo!" And everybody else screamed too, but I think they might have misunderstood me, because they all started to run away when I reached for my party cannon, except for those big guys that ran towards me, but they didn't look very nice at all, and...
Whitehorn looked up as Rarity entered, the pensive expression on his face splitting into a broad smile. "Aha! Lady Rarity! I was wondering when you would join us, and looking divine as ever, no less." Rarity waved the comment away with a huff.
Please, darling, there's no need for any of that anymore.
"Nonsense," Whitehorn said, leaning back. "I've always believed in speaking what thoughts wander into my mind, whether anybody around likes the sound of them or not." Rarity could feel her cheeks warming. She made herself busy looking over the few plates left on the table.
Cupcakes, French toast, cinnamon rolls, and muffins. Have you two been waiting for me all this time?
She levitated a muffin onto her plate, walking to take a seat beside Pinkie.
I do hope I haven't been holding you up.
"I don't think you could if you tried, my lady," Whitehorn said. "Your and Miss Pie's contributions outweigh what 100 stallions might do together. If all it costs me is a few extra minutes of lingering after breakfast, then, well, I'd be glad to pay that price." Rarity couldn't help but break out into a sunny smile as she sat down.
It's good to know that we are appreciated.
She took a bite out of her muffin.
Pancake flavor.
"Did you know that they've started calling you Auntie Rarity?" Whitehorn said, looking back down to his broadsheets. "The refugees, I mean." Rarity nearly choked, her eyes bulging in a brief struggle to swallow.
I'm sorry? Wherever did they get that idea?
Me,
Pinkie said, waving a hoof in the air.
they call me Auntie Pinkie too.
Ah, of course. I suppose I should have seen that one coming. Whitehorn, dear, what are the broadsheets saying today?
"Nothing good," the other unicorn said. He pushed them across the table in a neat stack. "We'll be hit by another surge soon." Rarity frowned around her muffin, levitating the papers up to her eyes. The bold, brash title of the center article grabbed her eye with all the tact of a mugger in an alley. "Thousands dead as calamity strikes Merwick." She took a deep breath before reading on. An urgent SOS from the island of Merwick was received just after noon yesterday at the Thaumagram station operated by Fellis Island's own Mr. Malay Drifts. Rarity failed to suppress a disdainful curl of her lip at the name. Mr. Drifts held communication with the island for roughly 2 hours as the Merwick operator described their island suddenly falling from the sky and into the ocean. An unknown number of airships escaped the island with survivors, but the remaining population of the island, which was home to over 5,000 ponies, is believed to have perished completely with the sudden attack of ocean-dwelling monsters. The article went on to describe an interview with Lay Drifts, but Rarity felt no need to read on. A hard lump had lodged itself in her throat by the time she looked up from the broadsheet.
That's terrible.
Whitehorn nodded, face grim. "They're speeding up, did you know? The falls, I mean." Pinkie Pie, who had sat down and started poking at a cupcake while Rarity was reading, shot up out of her chair.
I'm gonna take care of the dishes,
she said, scooping up the remaining plates with a few quick sweeps and balancing them on her back. Her mane seemed to have lost some of its luster.
I'll be back soon.
She said, and disappeared through the kitchen door. Rarity gave a slow shake of her head, looking out the dining room's gold-trimmed window at the swamp of refugees clogging Fellis' streams.
It's hard to believe. I never even heard of these catastrophes at all while I was in Highton.
Whitehorn let out a noise somewhere between a derisive snort and a dark chuckle. That's just the thing, Lady Rarity. Hard to believe. You might be surprised at just how much a pony will ignore to preserve the illusion of safety. It started out as just tiny little islands on the edge of the map, falling with a decade between them, you know. Queer little oddities to be wondered at over the dinner table by those in the know and forgotten by the morning. Things have changed now. But Equestria is slow to follow. He gestured a hoof at the window. Cultivar fell 8 months ago, and still the waterways here overflow with aimless bodies. Now Merwick has fallen. That's 2 populated islands less than a year apart, sunk to the ocean floor. Thousands drowned with them, and no doubt even now there's at least another 100 ponies coming to join the refugee camps here, and yet nothing is done. He stood up while he spoke, rising alongside his voice, and stepped over to the window.
That's not entirely true,
Rarity said.
We're here, aren't we? These ponies aren't entirely on their own.
Whitehorn heaved a sigh, nodding. Yes, Lady Rarity. We're here. You and Pinkie and dozens of volunteers and donors have helped with those struck by those calamities. But to what end? The islands still fall, and it seems no pony has a care to discover why. He turned his head, looking at her with one tired eye. Sometimes I fear Equestria won't wake up until 10,000 ponies are falling into the sea every week. And by then it will be too late.
Isn't that why you came here, darling?
Rarity asked, standing to walk to his side. She put a gentle hoof on his shoulder, smiling.
You are a writer, after all, and one with the connections to get the word out. There's no sense in fretting over what issues we can't solve, but we can all still do our part. Just keep your mind on your writing, and I'm certain Equestria will come around.
Whitehorn met her eyes, his frown curling up into a small smile. I suppose you're right. I don't know what I'm doing preaching to you when it's the rest of the world that needs it. He lifted a hoof to take hers, giving it a small squeeze. Thank you, my lady. Or shall I start calling you Auntie?
Oh, heavens, no!
Rarity feigned disgust, tossing her mane and looking away to disguise her blush.
I might be a few 100 years old, but I should hope it isn't starting to show so plainly already.
The two of them shared a laugh, his deeper voice harmonizing with her higher-pitched giggle. They spent a few minutes in silence, simply looking out onto the island below. Whitehorn was the first to speak. Well, I believe breakfast can be considered officially over. We have a busy day ahead of us as is, and the Merwick survivors will be here in a few days. We should get to work. Rarity dipped her head in agreement.
I couldn't agree more, Whitehorn. Did I tell you what I did last night? I roughed out a tent design that saves 1/3 of the fabric, and is even a little warmer at the same time. I think my fellow seamstresses will be quite grateful when they see it.